what got you involved in composition?
Yeah, so I think ever since I started like violin when I was 10, I've always like did have an interest like make like original music, and even when I was younger,
Yeah.
I would probably like improvise and like make like small like pieces on the violin. But when I was 16, in high school, the American Composers Orchestra has an outreach program for composers, and they happened to come to my school, and that's when I started like really taking it seriously and like start like working with like notation and like getting the pieces read. Like a lot of my music is inspired by place and memory and sometimes political things as well.
Oh, I definitely wanted to ask you that in terms of your piece for me in thought. But you mentioned some composers that have inspired you, and I'm just curious who were they or who are they today?
Yeah, I think Aaron Copeland is one who I've always looked up to since when I started. And I think now he still is, but I think composers such as Christopher Cerrone,
Hmm.
um, Caroline Shaw, Nico Muhly. Um, I also think Debussy is also plays like a influence on like music too. Mm.
That's interesting. So for the two older composers, shall we say, that you mentioned, I love Aaron Copland, and Debussy has been a lifelong interest of mine, both
Mhm.
as a flutist with the marvelous music he wrote for my instrument, but also as a historian. So I wrote my master's thesis in history on
Oh wow.
the influence of Asian music on Debussy, and I've done lots of different articles with Debussy and art and everything. And so I'm excited to hear you say that. And
Yeah.
it's actually also really interesting because of all the many composers I've worked with over time. And when I ask them, because I'm so curious what inspires today's composers and what composers of the canon inspire living composers, Debussy is so high up on the list for so many.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about in your piece, of course, because you wrote it as a reflection on the death of George Floyd, and it was right, I guess, after that that you were composing
Yeah.
this piece. And one of my questions was, do you often reflect on current events or political events in your music? Yeah, so I'd love to know more.
Yeah. Yeah, so End Thought was like really a reflection on everything that was happening like during that time in like May, June. And at first I thought that it was gonna be like this piece that represented like a lot of anger and like hopelessness. But I think this piece is more of like a question on what the future awaits and how do we like move on from here. And there is like a lot of conflict as well as just a lot of pensive like a pensive feeling in there. So yeah, that was like the influence for In Thought. And I think yeah, I find that a lot of the times I do think about like like how things are politically sometimes in our like in our world, and I think that does have an effect on my music sometimes. Yeah.
That's really interesting because in thought and even in your written program note, you talk about sort of like a meditative or introspective
Hmm.
quality, which I very much feel in the
Hmm.
piece as a performer, and even in the way you notate it. There are silences. It seems like there are literal pauses for reflection
Yeah.
in
Hmm.
there. And I guess I wanted to ask you too. Uh, for me, playing it, there was a sense that you might want it to sound a bit improvised or a bit like rhapsodic and free. And I was just wondering whether that was intentional or what you were thinking.
Yeah.
You also just mentioned that when you first started composing, it grew out of improvisations on your own instrument as a
Yeah.
violinist. I would love to know about that aspect of your music.
Yeah, and funnily, I think this piece was actually inspired by an improv that I did do. And improvisation is something that I do have as a part of my practice as a violinist. And recently, a lot of like the improvs that I have been doing, um, I use that material to like make a lot of my pieces now. And thought was definitely inspired by an improvisation. And I did imagine it to be like very improvisatory and like not strict and like very like rhapsodic, as you said.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Which leads me to how you use the flute sound, especially some effects that involve not full tone or like different
Yeah.
uses of air sound plus pure tone. Obviously, I guess you didn't really do that on your violin. How were you approaching the flute specifically, whether, to get some of those effects that are not coming from, I guess, directly your timbre on violin?
Yeah. Um, well, I think like a lot of those sounds and the inspiration from that came from like a lot of like listening that I did from some of the people who I like. And I think I just really like the sound of air when it's the flute. And I think sometimes I equate it to sometimes like still pont on the violin, like where it isn't fully clear, but there are harmonics that come out, and like a very ethereal texture.